We would like to start our 12th Genealogies of Memory conference. I'm very proud to do this for the 12th time. Thank you, Małgorzata Pakier and Joanna Wawrzyniak, who invented this circle of academic conferences, academic meetings made annually to exchange knowledge, to exchange doubts, and to meet all academics or many academics from different part of the world, researching on the memory and on history. My name is Rafał Rogulski. I'm heading the European Network Remembrance and Solidarity Secretariat based in Warsaw. But we are an institution making different projects, not only academic projects in different European and sometimes not only European countries. I will say something more about our institution in the second part of the day. And now I would like to ask Professor Jan Rydel, Polish coordinator of the European Network and a member of our steering committee. Professor Rydel has today two functions, even three as a speaker, but now two. He will be reading the letter to you, to all participants of the conference from the Minister of Culture and National Heritage of Poland, and then he will say some words in the name of European Network Remembrance and Solidarity.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I have great honor and pleasure to read the letter by Minister of Culture and National Heritage of the Republic of Poland, Deputy Prime Minister of Polish Government, Professor Piotr Gliński. Distinguished guests, participants of the conference Genealogies of Memory. For the 12th time in the Institute of the European Network Remembrance and Solidarity invited you, the representatives of diverse scientific communities from various countries and regions, to reflect on researching and describing history. Your aim is to underline the meaning of memory and commemoration. This year, you are focusing on international relations, which are undoubtedly a very current issue, and in this context, your reflection of expertise is very much needed. Therefore, I would like to thank the European Network Remembrance and Solidarity, led by Director Rafał Rogulski and his associates and partners for this important initiative. For months, due to Russia's full-scale invasion on the sovereign state Ukraine and its war crimes, we have been witnessing dramas and tragedies that were not supposed to happen anymore. Even though the legacy of two totalitarianisms, Nazism and communism, were supposed to be a warning for future generations and guidelines to work on development and of international relations based on understanding and cooperation. The trauma of the 20th century got back. The war began in Europe again. It is even more disturbing that history and memory are the aggressor's weapons as well. Misinterpreting historical facts and historical processes, creating new narratives, spreading historical disinformation, destroying the heritage of and culture of the Ukrainian nation are instruments that Russia, as an imperialistic regime, uses to seek justification for its criminal activities. The answer must be clear: the strong objection and action to block fake codes. That is why I see your work and commitment as a very important contribution to the development of a prosperous international environment and open democratic societies. Your work, research methods, publications of the scientific results, exchange and discussion, as well as the educational mission, especially towards younger generations, are important contribution to oppose the negative tendencies mentioned before. It is a task that we must all do to build a conscious, open and democratic society that is not vulnerable to the distortions of history and memory. As the Minister of Culture and National Heritage, I support numerous projects and initiatives aimed at the protection of national heritage, the creation of memorial sites in particular places that witnessed crimes of totalitarian regimes. I do treat the project of the European Network Remembrance and Solidarity as a special one. It is an extremely important initiative in which various countries, not only Germany, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary and Romania, but also Albania, Austria, Estonia, Georgia and Lithuania, undertake a common effort to build and understand the memory of 20th century's Europe in order to better cooperate in the 21st century. The example of cooperation should be undisturbedly continued nowadays. I wish you a fruitful discussion and numerous constructive conclusions from your debate, which will bring profit to all of us in performing your tasks and activities. Sincerely yours, Piotr Gliński. Thank you very much. Let me now say some words to you, dear conference speakers, dear guests. It is my pleasure to welcome you at the 12th Genealogies of Memory conference devoted to the topic of history and memory in international relations. The issue of how history is instrumentalized in contemporary international politics is a demanding research field. Arguments referring to the past, most often related to wars, violence, and violating of rights of some social groups by others, have been used in present time as a catalyst of international conflicts. By looking at contemporary international relations, one may get the impression that the number of conflicts in which a specific historical narration is employed has been increasing. The most extreme recent example being the Russian Federation's aggression on Ukraine. I am glad that after exploring diverse fields of history and memory in the Central and Eastern Europe, this year's edition of the Genealogies of Memory deals with the important topic of international relations. It has been the goal of the European Network Remembrance and Solidarity to initiate dialogue and to open exchange of knowledge and views around sensitive topics of the 20th and 21st century European history. And it is especially the goal of the project Genealogies of Memory to support high-level scholarship and sophisticated academic discussions on that. We are very grateful to our excellent partners who agreed to join us in the efforts of organizing this event. These are Center for East European and International Studies in Berlin, Seton Hall University, College of Europe, Natolin, Warsaw, Oxford School of Global and Area Studies at the University of Oxford, Faculty of Sociology at the University of Warsaw, Federal Institute for Culture and History of the Germans in Eastern Europe in Oldenburg. I would also like to welcome and thank the members of academic committee of the conference, Mr. Gabor Dani, Mr. Piotr Goldstein, Mr. Georges Mink, Ms. Beata Ociepka, Ms. Joanna Wawrzyniak, and Mr. Cheng Wang. Last but not least, I would like to introduce and thank the two conveners of the conference, Ms. Jade McGlynn and Mr. Bartosz Dziewanowski-Stefańczyk. Thank you all very much for your constructive cooperation and your fruitful input. I wish us all good and engaged discussions on this very important and topical issue of history and memory in international relations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Rydel. And now it became the tradition that we, during the welcome, we start with some speeches and then we go to conveners and say you something about the whole cycle of the conference, and then going further, we ask conveners from this year's conveners to say exactly, to go exactly to the point of our conference. But we will start now with Dr. Małgorzata Pakier, who, as I said, was and is still responsible for whole Genealogies of Memory conferences.
Good morning, all conference speakers and all guests. I represent the conceptual team of the Genealogies of Memory program together with Professor Joanna Wawrzyniak from the University of Warsaw. And as was said, we have started the program in 2011 and we have since then continuously organized annual conferences devoted to issues of history and memory in Central and Eastern Europe. And we started with a conference about the theoretical and methodological issues of memory research in this region and the specificity of the historical processes and the mnemonic processes and the mutual relation between them have been in the focus of the program. However, we have also employed a comparative perspective, and during the next conferences we studied regions of memory from a global perspective. And in the next years, we have moved to particular topics, asking about memory in relation to particular areas of social life, like memory in relation to law, memory and arts, memory and religion. And also post-communist transitions and the Holocaust have been topics of our conferences. And today we begin, it's about time to talk about memory and international relations and to employ the politological and historical relations and historical perspective. And I am very glad to both the conveners, Jade McGlynn and Bartosz Dziewanowski-Stefańczyk, as well as to the members of the academic committee of the conference for conceptualizing this event and this program that seems very promising, very interesting, and I wish everyone fruitful, engaging discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Dr. Małgorzata Pakier is head of our academic department, responsible also for all academic projects which we do. And now, Dr. Jade McGlynn and Dr. Bartosz Dziewanowski-Stefańczyk, the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. It's my great pleasure, after over a year of preparations, hundreds of emails, and untold Zooms, to be here in Warsaw and to be welcoming you all to History and Memory and International Relations, the 12th version of the Genealogies of Memory conference. We're really, really delighted that so many of you could come to Warsaw and also that so many are joining online. But you've already heard a wonderful amount about the Genealogies of Memory series, so perhaps it's probably about time that we got to the point, to borrow somebody's phrase. And let me hand over to Bartosz to talk in a bit more detail.
Yes, hello. Ladies and gentlemen, the topic of today's conference, of course, derives from our research interests and from the activities of the European Network Remembrance and Solidarity, but it was obvious for us that it is simply an important topic. When we started organizing it over a year ago, we knew that history and international relations are of growing importance, and it is a very under-researched topic. Of course, there are several studies on it, and I'm very glad that some of the researchers that do research into it are actually here with us in the library or online, but mainly in the library. However, then when we already started organizing it, the situation changed, of course. Jade?
Yes, unfortunately, it's clear that the relevance of this topic has only grown since we began to organize this last year. And unfortunately, we're seeing more and more the political instrumentalization of history, and sadly, most often in nefarious ways. Standing here in Warsaw, it seems pretty obvious, but of course I have to say it, that the most harrowing example of this is the way that the Russian state has instrumentalized history to justify its aggression, its continuing aggression and war crimes against Ukraine and Ukrainians. And I think bearing in mind the importance of this topic to politics, of course to us as academics, but also to policymakers and to people's lives, there are some really core questions that we would like to focus on in our discussions today and to sort of keep in mind. And they involve sort of whether or not the increased role of memory in international relations will inevitably lead to confrontation, or is there a way to use memory towards reconciliation? They also include sort of more specifics, I suppose, looking at the case studies, the different purposes for which political actors use memory and history, and what are these purposes, how do they use them, what images, what narratives, and so on. And finally, as well, I think the question of, in this globalized and interconnected world, to what extent can we still talk about a domestic memory, a domestic sort of narrative of history, and sort of probe sort of the transnational elements there. But let me hand back over to Bartosz.
Yes, well, it was difficult for us to prepare the program because we got so many great abstracts, so now we have to live up to the expectations. And we also have over 250 registered participants, mainly online, but also dozens of them here in the library, which just is a proof of how important this topic is. So we will have, during the conference, 3 keynote speeches by Professors Zheng Wang, Beata Oczepka, and Georges Mink today. Then we will have 8 panels, which will speak about theory and methodology, about heritage and culture in international relations. There will be various case studies from different parts of the world. Also, the researchers come from different parts of the world, which is very typical for this cycle of conferences. Then we will also speak, of course, about Russian memory wars against Ukraine. and about disinformation, and then also ethics of political commemorations. But then, because we are also interested in and future-oriented, we will at the end hold a discussion panel devoted to the future possible uses of history. We will have most of those panels here in the library and on Zoom, but then the keynote speeches, the Russian-Ukrainian panel, and the roundtable will be also available on Facebook. And of course, we welcome questions from all participants, and we hope that you will not only listen, but that you will also engage in discussions. And then it will simply be a step forward in the research on the history and memory in international relations. So thank you, and we wish you a very good conference.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Bartosz. Now the first chance to engage into the discussion. Our first keynote speaker will be Professor Georges Mink. We will start with some introduction about the person, and then Professor Georges Mink will give us a lecture, more or less 45 or 35 minutes.
35.
Okay. But let's start with some information about the first keynote speaker. Professor Georges Mink is a sociologist and political scientist specializing in Central and Eastern Europe. His research and publications, comprising more than 250 books, studies, and articles, are dedicated to political systems, the socio-political evolution of those regimes, the conversion of the ex-communist elites in Central and Eastern Europe, and the Europeanization of national political systems. Today, his research focuses on questions of transitional justice in European countries, EU countries. He is a director of research at the Institut de Sciences Sociales et de Politique, Université de Paris 10, and the president of the International Council of Central and East European Studies. He is also an associated professor at Sciences Po and visiting professor at the College of Europe, Natolin. He is and has been a member of several professional executive bodies, including the Administration Council of Radio France International in the years 1994, and the Executive Committee of the International Council for Central and Eastern European Studies, and the Scientific Council of the Social Sciences Faculty at the Charles University. Professor Georges Mink, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for all these kind words. Of course, your notice is a bit desactualized. I am no more president of ICSIS because there are mandates, and I had a 6 years mandate, so it is finished now. And the new situation when I am here is that I am the chairholder of the Civilization and History Chair European in the College of Europe, Natolin, and I am very glad that Natolin can contribute to your work in your network. We decided to be the part of your team, so I think that we have a nice future to work together with you.
Yes, it was very important for us to have Natolin on board.
Thank you very much, and I would like personally to thank you to invite me for this very exciting conference. As all French, I am not fully speaking English, but I will try to be clear. If something is wrong, excuse me. Okay, so let's go. On 28 June 2005, the Stefan Batory Foundation organized a conference entitled Memory and Foreign Policy. In this context, Bronisław Geremek, 4 years after his tenure as a Minister of Foreign Affairs, historian, specialist of poverty in the Middle Ages, asked himself if collective memory is part of foreign policy. Here is his answer. I think, I quote, it is a part of international relations, for example, when governments protest, when national dignity is attacked. Of course, it is a part of international negotiations, for example, to open access to archives. But all this is only marginal in foreign policy. We shall see whether this marginality of memory is true today. Since 24 February 2022, Putin's outrageous distortion of Ukrainian history to justify the all-out aggression against Ukraine raises question about the relationship of Russian geopolitical permanence to historical justification, and thus what international law and world order means to Kremlin. Indeed, since that fateful date, we have seen a kind of globalization of bilateralism that has imposed itself as a new world order. Because if Putin's historical revisionist vision was necessary for him, like a fuse to ignite the war, very quickly the historical argument gave way to the voice of arms and nuclear threat. The whole world was inevitably involved either because of the blocking of foodstuff, gas and fertilizer supplies, or because of the support of the West for Ukraine in terms of military equipment and of certain autocratic countries for Russia. The president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, thought his communication policy has largely contributed to the Europeanization and globalization of his country's cause. Since then, one wonders what role and what effectiveness historical revisionism and historical memory games can have in Putin's strategy. The Russian aggression was like a cold shower for our optimism as citizens of the European haven of peace established during the last quarter of the 20th century. But let's let Putin himself speak, who sums up his historical and memorial conviction in an article from July 2021. This article, entitled On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians, makes the 9th century Kievan Rus the integrating foundation of a people of which the Ukrainian capital, this mother of Russian cities, is the cradle. Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians, I quote him, are the heirs of the ancient Rus, which was the largest country in Europe. History has decided that the center of reunification, which continued the tradition of the ancient Russian state, should become Moscow. Vladimir Putin writes, Moscow is no longer the third Rome, but the new Kiev. In 988, it was the conversion of the Grand Prince of Kiev, Vladimir the Great, to Byzantine Christianity that sealed the spiritual fate of Russia. One strong hypothesis is that 11th century later, Vladimir Putin's reason for waging war against Ukraine is motivated by an absurd dream to restore the original empire. But is it operational enough to make the Russians rally to the idea of reconquest? Is it not too abstract a memorial referent? We will see later that Putin's geopolitics needs a historical narrative that is not only based on a collective cultural memory, as defined by, for example, by Aleida Assmann, but also on reactive memory, communicative, as Aleida Assmann would say. It is about the memories of witnesses, therefore still alive in the memory of the elders. This design must be subjected to an analysis that crosses the concept of geopolitics with that of the uses of history and historical memory. A second question must be asked at this point. Can or should we observe a break in the evolution of the uses of memory between 20th and 21st centuries? A conceptual clarification is also necessary here. We cannot speak of memorial geopolitics, but rather of a memorial component of geopolitical strategy. This observation invites us to look at the meaning of words, their narrative history, and their relevance to factual history. About geopolitics between the 20th and 21st century. When we founded the journal Geopolitics in France in 1981, one of its founders, General Pierre Gallois, provided us with the definition of geopolitics to which we have adhered for the 30 years of our journal's existence. Let me recall it here. Geopolitics, I quote, is a combination of political science and geography, but it also consists of a study of the relations that exist between the conduct of a power policy carried out at the international level and the geographical framework in which it is exercised. We were in the midst of an international crisis linked to the epic Solidarność and the declaration of martial law by General Jaruzelski. Memorial studies were absent from the geopolitical approach, even if the most astute analyst associated the idea of the existence of a more or less static mental map of world communism versus Western democracy with the European geographical space. At its birth, at the beginning of the 20th century, geopolitical thinking was based on a sort of Darwinian theory opposing weak states to strong ones. It was dominated by the thoughts of Friedrich Rydel, who considered that the driving force behind the formation of states was the struggle for living space. The person who most inspired Germany's geopolitical strategies in the early 20th century was a geographer and senior officer, General Karl Haushofer, who was in close contact with the leaders of the NSDAP party. His relation with Nazi dignitaries, such as Rudolf Hess, gave him access to Hitler's politics. His geopolitical concept of reconfiguring Germany's living space, claiming to be a victim of the Treaty of Versailles, became an inspiration for war. At roughly the same time, the Soviet geopolitical strategy of territorial conquest was developed, mystified by the messianic theory of the inevitable world revolution, notably by Lenin, which resulted in the failure of the Polish Bolshevik War in 1921, in contrast to the Bolshevik intentions. We can say, by a sort of shortcut, that the meeting of these two geopolitical approaches result first in the Rapallo Treaty of 1922 with a secret clause of military collaboration, then in 1939 in the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, to which we will return later. Stalin, after the victory of 1945, pleaded the need to surround himself with a security belt around the only socialist state, obsessed by the memory of the threats posed to the young Russian Revolution by the Western countries supporting the White armies. He was already justifying the conquest of the USSR neighboring states with history interpreted in his own way. In Stalinistic rhetoric, the conquest was camouflaged by the notion of friendly countries, friends forced to refuse the Marshall Plan and accept the Comecon and the Warsaw Pact. As we have just seen, geopolitical conceptions are closely linked to the historical context, to the configuration of political geography, as well as to the strategic construction produced by the actors involved in international relations. What happens in the field of memory in post-war period? In the immediate post-war II period, efforts are made to forget painful memories by adjusting historical and memorial narratives to the idea of the necessary obliteration of traumas, as the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur would have said, who devoted most of his work to the relationship between history and memory, to the fluctuations of memorial actions between overvaluing memory or obliterating it. The political diktat of memorial obliteration will be illustrated by the sentence uttered by Sir Winston Churchill in 1946, highlighted by the House of European History on one of the walls in Brussels. We must all turn our backs upon the horror of the past. We must look to the future. Indeed, following the failure of the Hitler project, the world order was frozen by the Cold War from 1948 to 1989, which can be summed up in a paradox formulated by the sociologist and specialist in international relations, Raymond Aron, who said, "Peace is impossible, war is improbable." At that time, the wars were far away, located in the former colonies, where anti-colonialist war slogan 1, 2, 3 Vietnam concerned the periphery of the Western countries. Western and Eastern Europe lived in the Aronian paradox of the period of nuclear deterrence. History was taking place on the periphery of the Western world, and the memory of the history of the Second World War was repressed and pushed into the unconscious among the victims. The last 2 decades of the Cold War, between 1970s and the 1980s, saw the emergence of polymorphous manifestations of memory. Paradigmatic studies are multiplying. These processes are just beginning to have an impact on geopolitics and the state of international relations. In these years, it is above all in the spaces of the nation-states that national memory undertakings swarm. In the West, the ongoing construction of Europe required a reconciliation of memories between the driving countries of this construction, France and Germany, multiplying historical memorial policy with the apotheosis of the 1984 recollection of Helmut Kohl and François Mitterrand, hand in front of the tombs of the soldiers of the 2 nations involved in the Battle of Verdun. Between East and West, the first embroids of Polish-German reconciliation appeared with the letter from the Polish bishops to the German bishops in 1965 and the beginning of the diplomacy of the forgiveness with Willy Brandt kneeling in front of the Warsaw Ghetto monument in 1970. This is the period when reconciliationism reigns and the memory games should only serve this purpose. Soviet Russia, on the other hand, is traversed from within by memory claims. Very briefly during the so-called dégel of 1956, then widely in dissident literature, culminating in the Gulag phenomenon under the major impact of Solzhenitsyn Gulag archipelago. Here memory serves civil society to reveal the historical truth of Soviet crimes. In the West, as if by memory dissonance, among the young Germans of the 1968 generation, there is a demand to account for the crimes committed by the forgetful grandparents. This was met by the revival of historical negationism in Western Europe, which focused on challenging the universally accepted narrative of the Holocaust with the denial of the existence of the gas chambers. In France, the academic world was shaken, notably by the activism of the negationist academic Robert Faurisson, as well as, in a different order, by the controversy provoked by Hannah Arendt around the trial of Adolf Eichmann. Soon, Germany will be confronted with the historians' quarrel, historical straight, on the relativization of the origins of Nazism, on the one hand with the work of Ernest Nolte, and on the other with the claim to denounce the Nazi criminals who found refuge in post-war Germany with the blessing of the Allies. This movement of memorial reactivation is symbolized by the slap given by Beate Klarsfeld to Chancellor Kurt Kissinger, or by the revelation of the past of Kurt Waldheim, officer of the Wehrmacht responsible for criminal actions in Yugoslavia, but also former Secretary General of UN. In France, the ambiguities of the Gaullist narrative on the resistance in France, and in the wake of this on the responsibilities of the Vichy regime, were timidly put on the public agenda. The French case is of interest to us because of an intensification of work on the politics of memory. Several facts are shaking the certainties of French memory by destabilizing the balance of identity. This will be fertile ground for the birth of Pierre Nora's paradigms of place of memory, lieu de mémoire. France was still digesting the effect of the 1968 Cultural Revolution and was experiencing the oil crisis, which revealed to the French that the 30 years of abundance and carefree consumption were over. It was also the end of the empire, with the abandonment of Vietnam to the Americans, followed by the victory of the Viet Cong over them, and the somewhat chaotic withdrawal of possessions in North Africa. Pierre Nora and his team noted that the need for a memorial identity reference, a reunion with a glorious past and with the roots. This will result in a monumental work listing the places of memory. The model will spread to many countries, notably to Russia, directed by Georges Mink. The paradigm will be implemented everywhere where a social need will be felt in bilateral relations, driven by the concern for reconciliation. Hagen Schulz and Etienne François also produced a monumental inventory of French-German places of memory. Hans-Henning Hanf and Robert Raba co-directed an immense four-book challenge about the Polish-German lieu de mémoire. But at that time, this wave of memorial commemorations did not yet intersect with international relations other than in an effort to appease conflict in past in bilateral reasons. It is interesting to look at state memory policy in Soviet Union because it helps to understand the turn of memory from the 20th to the 21st century. Despite or because of the primacy of the Marxist-Leninist ideology, Soviet propaganda sought to consolidate a militaristic model in the collective memory. The discursive sources of Putinism, as diverse as they are obsessively aimed at two targets: the idea of empire and the apology of war. This is the common background of the Sovietism, Orthodox imperialism, Russian conservatism, Pan-Slavism, Euro-Azism. But Putin can serve on this ideological mishmash because the collective memory of the Russians who support him was already preformed in the USSR, and only then consolidated by the propaganda tubes under Putin's rule. The education of the Soviet citizen consists of military preparation. His life was spent in various military patriotic associations. The calendar was filled with military holidays. Honoring the fighters of the great patriotic war was a civic obligation. It was as if the Russian collective memory has been militarized. What is happening in the 1990s in the relationship between memory, history, and politics? After the end of communism and the disappearance of the bipolarity of two ideological blocs, memorial events depend and multiply, opening up a wide repertoire of actions and a vast space for competition around the painful past of the 20th century. The memorial paradigms then intersect with geopolitics, which remains essentially fixed by analysis of the reasons for and consequences of the Cold War. We know that the geopolitical axis structuring the Cold War period was East-West. It partially extended beyond this period when the demands for the remembrance set the European institutions on fire, the European Parliament and other executive bodies of the European Union, but also the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. The 1990s and the first years of the year 2000 saw an intensification of the exchange of blows between the actors representing the interest of national or state groups that considered themselves to have been robbed by the Second World War. In the memorial field, the battle for memorial adjustment between Russia and the countries liberated from the communist bloc took place, symbolically illustrated by the discussion on the asymmetry of the EU's memorial legitimization, on the necessary requalification of communism as a totalitarian regime in the same way as Hitler's Never Again regime was. The battle would result in an attempt to enclose singular histories in a single museum narrative towards a transnational vision in a European house of history. It is far from completely satisfying the various entrepreneurs of European memory. Several transnational initiatives reflecting both the East-West axis and the European left conservative right partisan divide will attack the general design of the permanent exhibition in Brussels as ideological, Hegelian, and neo-Marxist. These initiatives will highlight voluntary gaps in the museum narrative. After a study visit in 2017, an international group of historians and museum officials dedicated to the history of the crimes of communism or to totalitarianism, organized in a platform of European memory and consciousness, will publish a rich critical report. Some of these entrepreneurs of memory will achieve real legislative successes in the EU Parliament. In 2009, the European Parliament established a day dedicated to the memory of the victims of two totalitarian regimes on the 23rd of August. In line with this, several EU member states will add to the ban on symbols of the Nazi regime those characteristic of communist propaganda. Controversy could even flare up over whether to include a ban on the Che Guevara t-shirts. The date of the 23rd of August is a strong memorial symbol, as it was the day of the signing in 1939 of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, with the secret annex postulating the invasion of Poland by the two countries. This episode of European geopolitical history will remain to this day the most mobilizing point in international memorial relations between Russia and Western historians, especially in declaring when the war began for the Russians. In May 2009, the president of the Russian Federation, Dmitry Medvedev, in the face of symbolic initiatives by the EU and the Council of Europe to equate Stalinism and even communism with Nazism, elevated history to the level of an attribute of national sovereignty. On the occasion of the 70th anniversary of the beginning of the Second World War and the German-Soviet Pact, which Europe was preparing to commemorate, the Russian president said, "One should not call black what is white, call one who was defending himself the aggressor." These words were accompanied by the creation of a presidential commission to fight against falsification of history. Many Russian historians protest at the time against the likely pressure of the supervisory body, which, under pretext of tracking down and countering erroneous interpretations of history abroad, would make the arbitrariness of political censorship official. The banning of the Memorial Association under a law that allows a local NGO to be classified as foreign-sponsored and therefore a foreign agency has definitively corroborated these fears. In fact, this phenomenon of state intrusion into the field of history is omnipresent in many societies. The differential regimes of the uses of memory coexisted during the post-Cold War years. On the one hand, commissions and historians multiplied, such as the one led by Anatoly Torkunov and Adam Rothfeld, with an optimistic message to neutralize contentious points in Polish-Russian history, such as the recognition of the elimination of Polish elites by Stalin's NKVD in Katyń. Another commission of Polish and Ukrainian historians is trying to neutralize fanciful or differentiated historical interpretations of the Volhynia massacre or the Vistula action, trying to quantify the number of victims on both sides and to understand the reasons of the massacres. On the societal level, installation artists revive the painful past of the end of almost the entire Jewish community in Poland with the intention of both civic awareness and memorial appeasement, as for example the outdoor installation of a public bench with a kippah and the inscription, "I, we, miss you Jew" by Rafał Betlejewski. On the other hand, in July 20, 2013, in one Polish small city, Radymno, near Przemyśl, inhabitants went so far as to stage a grisly reconstitution of Ukrainian attack and massacre of Polish villagers in the Volhynia region during the Second World War, and rather with the effect of aggravating Polish-Ukrainian relations. In Spain, a war of memories is taking place. The Moncloa Pact on the principle of amnesty and amnesty cracked when the PSOE, new generation of socialists, took over. In the years of the turn of 20th and 21st centuries, memory laws revisited the past of Franco's crimes around unpunished and forgotten assassinations. The archaeology of mass murders developed under the impetus of the archaeological excavations on the mass grave of Srebrenica. In Spain, this accompanied by collective actions called Caravan of Memory that seeks to identify the mass graves containing Republicans' victims. What happens during this period for memorial studies? They are dominated by several conceptions that shed light on the processes of collective memory formation. I do not have space here to describe them in detail. In France, there is a revival of Maurice Halbwach's paradigm explaining the formation of the collective memory of social groups and classes. Pierre Nora's paradigm is disseminated almost worldwide, while Paul Ricoeur's paradigm explores the psychological mysteries of memory processes. The duty to remember the uses and abuses of memory, done, for instance, by Tsvetan Todorov, are discussed. Normative judgments are made about good and bad memory work. Elsewhere, the work of Aleida Assmann and Jeffrey Olick, to name but a few, is also flourishing, focusing on the explanation of the processes of memory collection or the effects of the transition from individual communicative memory to what Aleida Assmann calls cultural memory. All these paradigms have limitations, the main one being that they explain what happens within the national framework, or bilaterally, when it is a question of recalling an interstate conflict, whereas memory games are becoming globalized and are becoming narrative support of the new geopolitics. The logic of the bilateral games of appeasement, characteristic of the immediate post-Cold War period, is being replaced by bellicose tendencies which by means of the reactivation of conflictual past, seek international competition, the stigmatization of the adversary, the exclusion of political enemies, and, for Russia, constitute the prelude to territorial conquest. The revival axis of conflicts involving painful past multiply as between China and Japan, Japan and Korea, Italy and Slovenia. Greece demanded war reparations for Germans, followed by the Polish government. Spain is the object of demands for reparations by certain Central American countries. The avatars of colonialism are reflected in the claims of former colonies for the restitution of cultural goods and material reparations. Since 2019, the resolution of the European Parliament obliged the member states to take specific measures, such as the restitution of looted goods or to allow free access to the archives of colonialism. The geopolitical memorial fault lines are being renewed, especially between African and Asian countries and former colonizing states such as France, Great Britain, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Portugal. These discussions are the direct consequence of the multiplication of memorial laws which seem to impose censorship on the work of historians. The massive eruption of historical public policies launched by certain politicians or on all sides irritates historians. Even more so when social activists, journalists, police officers, judges, diplomats, or members of parliaments interfere in the disciplinary field and when social media are inflamed. It is in this period, at the turn of the century, the 20th and 21st, that we feel the need to reflect on concepts proper to political sociology, which include both the games of memorial actors and their undertakings of the internationalization of memorial strategies. What is the change of scale in the first decade of the new millennium? But first, to better define the concept, we need let's go back to Putin's historicization strategy. Today, Putin appears to be an epigon and continuator of the visions of Rydel and Haushofer, but especially of Stalin. In reality, Putin basically thinks the same thing but needs another justification. And this is where a memorial masquerade comes in. Nazism, racism, anti-Semitism, and a reminder of the origin of Russia's greatness. The portfolio of historical and memorial references does not stop for Russia at European history. Since Putin's speech to the audience of sad and empty-looking regime beneficiaries, except for infantile excitement of Kadyrov, on the 30th of September 2022, after the counting of the so-called democratic referenda to announce the annexation of the 4 oblasts of Ukraine, the Russian president has been emphasizing the clash of civilization in the Huntingtonian manner. He reminds the Russian generation that lived under Soviet rule of the dominant ideology. The accusation of the colonialist West with the American Devil and his axiological degeneracies as a main topic. However, the core of the revisionist mobilizing discourse is not the 1,000-year-old history of Russia, such as that recounted by Putin at the beginning of the invasion in February 2022, which I reported in the introduction, nor that of the clash of civilizations. At the center of the memorial device is the great patriotic war. Why is this so? In the early 2000s, and even more so since the annexation of Crimea, a memory offensive has taken place around the Great Patriotic War against Nazism of 1941-1945, to the point that it is now a kind of mystical cult. In fact, in order to justify the reconstitution of the empire, necessarily by military means, Putin must have not only his army and generals behind him, but also the population. It is a question of building legitimacy by resorting to a historical vision. Putin's geopolitics of Russian conquest has nothing to do with a historical truth verified by the scientific approach. What counts is the mobilizing effectiveness of the narrative. In order to achieve this effect, a certain type of memory must be used, a reactive memory of the Russians. This is the memory of the Second World War. The Great Patriotic War is not an lieu de mémoire, even if it has several locations, such as the Battle of Stalingrad or the Soviet flag planted of the Reichstag in Berlin. It is rather, as I used to say, a memorial deposit. This concept, designated by its metaphorical connotation more than a lieu de mémoire, a stock of resources that can be recycled in the present political or geopolitical stakes. Various actors draw on these territorial or imaginary event deposits for the symbolical materials needed to fuel competitions. In the case of the Great Patriotic War, this is a living memorial material. This material is based, as Adam Michnik metaphorically put it, on the egoism of pain, due to the human cost suffered by the Soviet and on the exaltation of pride in victorious sacrifice. Also, there remains an obstacle to these uses by Putin, namely the controversy over when the Great Patriotic War actually began and what actually happened between 1939 and 1941. But the Putin narrative does not need to explain itself to the Russian population. Exploring this memorial deposit is enough to gain support of around 80% of the population for his strategy of including Ukraine in the empire. By a way of conclusion, almost 20 years later, in the middle of the 21st century, Professor Geremek's observation has become obsolete. Collective memory is summoned not to support diplomatic negotiation, but to paraphrase Karl von Clausewitz, to justify a particular foreign policy by other means, that is, by war and by the geopolitics of territorial expansion. But we can also see that Putin only needed historical justification to justify the launch of a geopolitical adventure. But when the guns started talking, his memorial discourse became muddled and incoherent. Perhaps because remembering the tribute of blood paid by Russian and Ukrainian part of the population between 1941 and 1945 revived the reflection on the meaning of today's sufferings, thanks to the Russian and Ukrainian blood that is shed abundantly in the war against Ukraine, and at the risk of turning the Russian population against the geopolitics of conquest and the memorial makeup. But this is unfortunately, only another hypothesis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mink. Thank you for this jump from the 20th to the 21st century, as you wrote in the title of the speech. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we are waiting for the questions. Please use the micro and introduce themselves, because it will be recorded. Yeah.
No, okay. Thanks. Thank you very much, Professor Mink, for such an interesting keynote. I think probably I'll just have one question for now. But towards the end, you were talking about the extent to which sort of Putin has used these historical narratives to appeal to the population. But could we see it the other way around, in the sense that, of course, he uses these narratives because they resonate, but is it top-down or is it bottom-up? How do we sort of define these uses of history? I mean, perhaps after, certainly from my research into this... Sorry, can you not hear me?
I'm sorry.
Could you just clearly repeat the question?
Sure. So is it top-down or bottom-up, these historical narratives in Russia, in your opinion? Does the demand come from the people below?
There are very various situations, you know. It's depend of the national situations and also of the politics that are practiced by the government. For instance, if you have a look to the old Europe, if we can say Rumsfeld designation of old and new Europe, the question are more peaceful in a certain sense, because there is not a very big need of games of memory. You have, of course, the fraction of the society, very small fraction, who would like to go back to some pieces of the controversial history. But there is no big competition and big struggle, except maybe countries where it was not really solved, like in Spain, what I quoted. And it is also the political struggle, because the side of Republicans, of course, was private of their history. So they, from years and years, they consider that Pact Moncloa was something like a betrayal of the memory of Republicans, and starting from this young generation that I quoted, they, when they had the power, they decided to publish laws, memory laws, reactivating the memory of Republicans. And on the basis and in the society level, it was immediately the echo by this organization of Caravan of Memory, Graves research, and this archaeology of dead, what I called. In other Western countries, is not so present. Of course, there was an episode of Vichy contestation during 70s, but it is an old story now in France, even if we have still in France some component of the political scene referring to this period, especially extreme right, Marine Le Pen, for instance, but also she now understood that this is not a good card to play in the political games. From the society, you have the most interesting thing is the revolt of historians and associations of historians. In France, we have, for instance, 3 different associations, professional associations, left, center, and right. And all of them are struggling to exclude from the historical studies the intervention of politicians and a lot of professionals who would like to speak about the history without knowing really the history and the facts. and not so interesting by the verification, academic verification of facts. But at this moment, I can say this is a peaceful situation. In the Eastern countries, it's really different because, first of all, the, how you say, chape de plomb, ołowiany dach.
How to say
the exclusion? Yes, plumb ceiling. Yes, yeah, was so long, and the opening of this space of memory discussion is relatively new. This is not 60 years, this is only 30 years, and even less than 30, because the transitional period was a bit like in Spain after the Pact Moncloa. It was best to do the amnesty and even a part amnesty. So I think that the games are more active, of course, and especially this feeling that West don't understand the East and the past of East. And this is very well illustrated by the lot of initiative coming from bottom up, society initiatives. For instance, this platform organized in Czech Republic first, then internationalized. Even some Western participants are in this platform, and they are very careful with how European Union is dealing with the history and this memory adjustment demanded by this platform. And there is another new tendency, of course, everybody here knows about woke and cancel culture and things like this, that there is a new demand, especially in the countries, post-colonialist countries, which have a strong component of descendant of the slaves. This is the case of France, for instance. We have something, it is not still like in United States, no strong and not really introduced in the universities, for instance, or partly in the margin. But as you know, in United States, it is very present in all universities. And this is the work of memory, of course, coming from the bottom up and demanding the change of spirit, considering that all white people, but even black, has this colonialist vision still in the heads. So there is a new field of games, and if we speak about how it's waging in the how weight it has in the geopolitics, of course, playing a role, and I mentioned that, of course, between countries which were colonized and countries colonizator. So there is a translation in the politics, external politics, with very different issues in reality. I am not sure that I satisfied your question.
Thank you. Chen Kwang.
I'm Jeon Lim from Korea. My question is rather simple. I mean that the role of Karl Haushofer, who conveyed the idea of Ratchel's Lebensraum to Hitler through Hess, is quite a well-known story. But on the other hand, recently some historians found his letter exchange with Frederick Jackson Turner. Means that the Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis to explain the peculiarity of American democracy is surprisingly close to a Ratchel's Lebensraum, and they exchanged letters, and they found their interests overlapping between the frontier thesis by Frederick Jackson Turner and Karl Ratchel's Lebensraum. Means that the reason why I raised this point to this discussion is that nowadays in Eastern Europe, I see certain a sort of black and white binary criticism against Putin's colonialism. On the other hand, they tend to unconsciously justify the other part of colonialism in the West. Means that this the episode that connects a Haushofer and Rydel and Frederick Jackson Turner in the United States, in a sense that even though those Western democracies, in their memory politics, they consciously or unconsciously hide the past of colonial past and colonial brutality, colonial cruelty. And recently, this Mbembe debate in Germany shows us that how this still colonial past, the remembrance of colonial past is one of the keys to understanding the landscape in Europe beyond the binary East and West. So I think that the one thing missing I felt from your excellent talk is that this how to deal with the colonial past in both Europes, in Eastern Europe and Western Europe. I think it can be one of the very important points through which we can really understand the today's memory politics in Eastern Europe, especially revolving around the war, the Putin's invasion of Ukraine. So that's just one point I want to discuss.
Thank you very much for your. It's mostly commentary than question, but I absolutely agree with you that there is in traditional vision of the role of memory or historical justification in the international relations. There is something like we are, in a certain sense, a bit too late to accomplish all problems of memory, but there is one thing that if you look at the work of different parliaments in Western countries, you can see that more and more there is a pressure, especially in the countries, colonialist countries, to recognize this past and to ask for the reparation, reconciliations, and so on. But still, I agree with you, there is this contradiction in a certain sense. And there is still also the resistance. For instance, if you look at the French parliamentary, when there was voted the law of memory considering colonialism, the opposition, strong opposition, was about yes, it is true that we are cruel and so on. We had this understanding, geopolitics theory, but we gave to these countries and to those primitive people the civilization, roads, schools, and so on. So there is still this tension between two options, and the conservative especially are defending in the countries like France, Great Britain, Portugal, and so on, this option. We had reason to go to those countries and to put up, in a certain sense, their level of civilization. So this is the contrast of two things.
Western European countries from Soviet Union, so-called welfare colonialism, towards Central Asia and the peripheries of Soviet Union. So I found this surprisingly similarity between this sort of conservative approach to the colonial past in the West and this welfare colonialism as a sort of justification ideology to Soviet hegemony in the Central Asia in the former Soviet Union,
yes,
and certain continuity of that sort of ideas we can find from not only Putin but also from the just general public in Soviet Union.
Yeah, this is very interesting because in reality, if we can so widely discuss about that, it is thanks to Putin. Because Putin revealed for us the side of this question in shadow, in a certain sense. And you are Japanese. Korean. So, of course, no, why sorry? In contrary, there is a huge conflict between your country and Japan, as you know. And of course, I think, but it is the hypothesis, that the memory games will be more developed now, where it was totally locked in Japan, for instance. The question of what Japan did in Asia was locked. Even if there were the demands of China, for instance, for Nanking episode and things like this. But I think that the Putin, paradoxically, will open a lot of discussion and maybe decisions concerning this question of colonialism in other parts than Western parts of colonialism. I don't know if it is satisfying for you, but...
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I have the microphone. Professor Mink, thank you very much for your speech. And so you show how geopolitics provides or imposes a framework for memory processes, which is very interesting. And now my question would be how you see the development of the European memory culture now after the Russian aggression on Ukraine. Does the European memory culture, I would say in singular deliberately, have the chances to survive? And as you mentioned, it has been based on ethical categories, on the post-war order to maintain peace, to never again allow things like the Holocaust or other crimes, and so on. And politics has been, so to say, transparent in this, and it have been the ethical categories that have shaped these memories. Do you see that it has a chance to survive in confrontation with the Russian memory politics, or will it have to consolidate in some specific ways? And how do you see the place for heroic memories within it?
Thank you for this question. I am a bit pessimistic, and it is connected with my way to analyze the question of memory games, because I consider that in contrary of French mainstream in the memory studies, which was imposed by Pierre Nora, the memory games are never frozen. It is the reason that I use, but in French it's better than in English, gisement de mémoire, memory deposit, of course, which is something like memory places, of course, but with a lot of materials that you can reactivate when you want to reactivate, but you want to reactivate when the conditions to this reactivation are good for you. You are sure that you will be the winner of this kind of struggle. In this way, I think, speaking about European resistance, memory resistance to the memory attacks of Putin, I am not pessimistic. I think that we dislocated during the last months totally the justification of Putin's aggression. There is no more, in the view of Europe, and except some, we know, some very small fraction in Europe, there is no more credibility for explanation, Putin's explanation of his attack. Nobody believes Putin, especially for this part of, everybody believes that he still has nuclear power, that he still can do some damages, brudna wojna, dark war and so on, but not by the historical justification. He is not credible in this sense. But inside of Europe, we have still some deposit of memory who could be reactivated, of course. We can imagine that the extreme right arrived to the power in more than one country. not only Italy, but Spain, maybe France. We don't know, but it is still possible in 3 years. And in another country, we can receive something like revisionism of the European history of the Second World War, and maybe also colonialism. And then we will reactivate this common memory that we as Europeans construct and put inside the museum, the house of European history. But even that, if you do, I suppose that you visited the House of European History. This is something like a confession of impossibility to embed the European history in one place, because we have a lot of European histories. And the only way to do that and satisfy everybody is to do the individual representations, place by place, country by country, history by history, and then to organize the connections and show when the conflicts appeared and could still reappear. This is my answer. I am not sure that it is satisfying. But heroic, yes, heroic memory. I don't like this normative question, because I think the memory is memory. The heroic, it seems that actors of memory consider that they did something exceptional. The heroization of the memory is also the arm in the struggle. That you show that you have glorious memory against somebody who is your adversary, in a certain sense. So if we can consider that this really exists, and it is existing in the normative narratives, of course, then it has a very long life. I am quite sure that, for instance, Stalingrad will be all the time something like a heroic history. I don't know, Verdun will be not heroic history, but the contrary of heroic history. And you can find a lot of episodes in the European history where, for instance, if you look to the fraction of nostalgic Frankists in Spain, for them, 36, 39 is the heroic history. So they will put this heroic history on the table, discussing with others, and if possible, trying to obtain the power thanks to this kind of heroic narrative. So I think that this is a long life for heroic, but also for some. This problem is, of course, for historians, how to stop this kind of controversial competitions. Can we stop this controversial competition? This is also the challenge for politicians. I think that it was the very good moment that I quote between, but we can find a lot like this, between Helmut Kohl and François Mitterrand. They erased totally the history of both nations just to obtain the consent. But the consent also is dangerous, because the consent is done to be contested, of course, in the memory struggle. So this is a very fluctuating situation.
Hi, I'm Bradley Reynolds from the University of Helsinki. Thank you for the talk, Professor Mink. A lot of this reminds me, too, of the use of history by decision makers from the 1970s, Neustadt and May. And I'm kind of interested in this comment you made about the development of memory games. I believe in their work that this was mostly domestic for political use, but it seems that, for example, this histories of the Great Patriotic War are for domestic consumption in Russia, but they've also been attempted to activate some type of transnational memory. And I believe in memory research, there's a term memory traction, and this goes to kind of the comment you made about reserves, memory reserves. So these narratives might have traction in Russia, but they might be less successful in Europe or internationally. So kind of, this is more of a clarification question is, can you talk maybe a little bit more about the development of these memory games? Are you kind of saying that there's an attempt to use memory more transnationally in this geopolitical context than we've seen previously? Or, yeah, so thank you.
This is a very good question, and there is a lack in my expose, I have to confess that, about the new medias and the work of new medias, because new medias internationalize memory causes very fastly and in an uncontrolled fashion, that we cannot really stop this kind of things, and they trolls and this kind of categories, social categories, who work in the international level, of course. They can transfer some causes present inside of the country, but demanding something from outside, they can transfer this kind of causes outside, of course. This is the part of memory games that I absolutely agree with you. I have to add a paragraph about that, because this is a thing that we are not accustomed to observe, or we start to observe that very not so tak dawno.
Not from the long time.
Not from the long time. This is a new part of the memory studies. How the memory is reactivated by the social medias, and this is really geopolitics of circulating in the world, in social medias. This is an important point. Yes?
Are you interested in, yeah? Yeah, you are the first, and then
Very much. Is that on? Yes. Hello there. Thank you. I'm David Wood from Seton Hall University. So thank you to the organisers and for the first talk. It's wonderful to be part of this. You talked about the idea of memory games, and in one of your responses to Jade, you talked about how there's an attempt to protect political interference in historical research and the understanding of history. Is there a case that we should also be protecting politics from the interference of historical research in some points as well? Because politics is a process of working out the best ideals of society, of truth. It is a game. And that game needs to be played, and it does draw on history as part of that game. And so I'm very interested in the role of historians in perhaps helping to make that game a more positive one. Mm-hmm. And I think at some points it can be that we overstep the mark, because in every example of a Russian invasion of Ukraine, there is an example where you have two states or two groups in society that have genuinely different historical priorities. They look at the past and they might prioritize different elements of that. And there's a conversation that needs to happen there. And we might interfere with that conversation sometimes. So it'd be good to understand the rules for historians and the rules of the game as well. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I have just to explain my model of analysis, because it was not absolutely 100% involved in this expose. When I analyze different memory games, I use, because for me, it's needed dynamic sociology, not the sociology of fossilized places of memory, but the contrary of that. So I use something like a triptych, strategy of historization, reactive memory, which is still, this is something like a communicative memory, and this gisement mémoriel, deposit of memory. Why? Because And then we go to politicians. Politicians has something very interesting, not all of politicians, but some of them, that have a noise to recognize in the history and in the state of memory, situation of memory, what is the most, what can give them the added value in their politics. They are like dogs, you know, searching some mushrooms. They recognize that. And if they are in this immoral, because for me it is in a certain sense, immoral situation to use the history for the bad goals, they are very efficient. They find the points and then play with the symbolical materials in the games. We have different paradoxical situations, as still I am referring to France, with the President Sarkozy. Sarkozy had a good advisors, historians, and they give him some solutions to unify French public opinion or French political scene by the history. And he did, of course, the stupidities. Because, for instance, he obliged all school children to read a letter of the young student, French student, who was in the resistance in France as a communist, and he was shot by Germans. But just before execution, he wrote this fantastic letter to his mother, and he started to be the emblematic symbol for the Communist Party. So Sarkozy considered that if he gave this letter to all students, and they will sacrifice 1 hour of their school to read this by voice reading, this something like a mess, you know, of all these students, he will obtain the unification. And it was the contrary, of course, because it started to be more and more controversial, because this is a legitimacy of these communist people in France. And this is a kind of uses of the memory of something that you can still revival, because there are still actors or simple people who remember, who has this link of memory, collective link. This is Halbwach's concept. So, but the relation, this is an important thing, because that you mentioned that there is a real problem between academic world and politicians as to the history uses and abuses. But we have a lot of work about that. You know, in France there is a big school working about uses and misuses of the history. For instance, we have you certainly had this name, Henri Rousseau. Henri Rousseau, who developed the controversial narrative of history concerning Vichy. And he pushed the power years and years after the war to recognize that Vichy, it was impossible to forget that. It must be on the table. And the first reaction of politicians was to the censorship, to Rousseau. Then the second step, when it appears for some of politicians rentable, how you say, added value in politics, they immediately put Rousseau in the pedestal, in the monument, and now he is the main important historian for this recognition of the true in history. So there is a very complex, and I think this three association is the proof that they are on one side for the freedom of the academic work, and on another side to be very careful with the uses of the history and the memory by politicians.
Professor Georges Mink, we have still 1 minute before the break, so 2 last questions. You first, and then... Be fast, please.
California last year at our conference was calling for kind of demobilization of communication and the media discourse related, among others, to history. So do you see any chances for that when it comes to the discourse on history and memory in the foreign relations, or are we only getting started with the problems?
Maybe we could collect.
Yeah?
The last question.
Okay, Bartus. Thank you very much, Professor, for your milestones of 20th, 21st century. Just one comment and one question. The question is about the role of memory itself, because more and more often with a certain dominance of memory right now, we are forgetting about history. And memory is becoming, in my opinion, a monster which is starting to swallow history itself and swallow the methodology of history. And the basic methodology in this science is obviously the cause-effect relation, is the chronology, and facts. Memory is actually bypassing those and putting us into the situation in which a person like Vladimir Putin can, from this resource of memory or resource of lieu de mémoire, can pick and select pieces, and with the usage of media and social media, construct whatever he wants. And actually, he's very much building it on the general ignorance of history in his population, which is again an effect of a lack of education. So I'm not sure whether this is not the problem in the nowadays world, which is post-modern and fractioned and lacks a certain coherence, which is typical for history as science. So that's one thing. Another thing, which is a comment from our friends from Korea. Thank you very much for pointing to colonialism in Asia. I would actually expand it into also the 23rd of August of 1939 as another incarnation of a colonial policy against Central Europe. It is nothing else but a typical colonial attempt against Central Europe. And the question is whether we can actually make this linkage of putting the Central European experience into the general experience of 20th century colonialism.
With those questions, we can start the next conference, probably.
Now, thank you for all these comments and questions. As to the chances, I don't know. I think that the spectrum of possibilities is very large, and it really depends on the something different than memory and history, which is the situation, political situation. That if you have educated elites, the societies with a good level of historical knowledge and so on, you can neutralize, in a certain sense, negative gains of the memory. So in this way, I am a bit optimistic. And I have seen that in the German-French reconciliation. Books, scholar books, gesticulation, narratives, and exchanges, human exchanges, with the confrontation of different narratives during the exchanges. So I think that this is maybe a chance to finish with the memory struggles, but I am not sure. You know, we had in France a long discussion about, is it the opposition between history and memory? And finally, there is a mainstream now that we have to include the memory inside of the academic field of history. Because, first of all, we know what is the position of standby there, for instance. Those who can give us not only the chronology, but the existential facts. And then to verify if their memory is wrong or not wrong. They give us the indications to go somewhere. And this is the first point. The second point concerning the general concept of colonialism, for us is clear. This is the colonialism. But curiously, a very strong vision of colonialism is connected with Africa, Asia, and not so much with Europe, you know, in the sense that Europe in the past was colonized, some country in Europe. For instance, when you discuss about three empires who divided Poland, there are some of authors who speak about colonialism, but others speak only about rapport de force, how you say, force situation of these three empires, with this geopolitical extension to obtain more free space, but not in terms of colonialism, which is strange, of course, because it was a typical colonialist behavior, of course. And we can do some differentiation between Austrian, Hungarian Empire, Prussian Empire, and Russian Empire, and we know the strongest colonialism war in Russia, but this is, of course, the object of. But we have something like a stereotype that the real colonialism was countries that I enumerated, face to Africa, Central America, and Asia. And this is probably something still to work about that.
Thank you very much. I'm sure that the discussion is much more interesting and much more important than break, but we have now a little bit shorter break and meet in 23 minutes for the first panel of the conference. And now please have some refreshment here probably on the right side. Thank you very much.